The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden haze over the sprawling lawns of Regina Walters' estate. The distant hum of the city seemed worlds away. Charleston was still, as it often was on afternoons like this. Quiet, almost reverent. The breeze carried the scent of salt water, a promise of the sea not far from where she stood. It was peaceful, but not for long. Regina stood on the porch of her grand house, her hands clasped behind her, a steady wind brushing through her hair. She wasn't worried about the breeze. It was too familiar. The estate had become her sanctuary, a place where she had finally found her rhythm, where the world could no longer make her feel small. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being the woman in the power position, the one who called the shots. She'd worked hard for every inch of what she had now. But on this day, it felt like the world was about to remind her of her place. It had started with a phone call, a man she hadn't heard from in years. Jack Howard, the kind of man who used to dismiss her dreams as too big. The kind of man who would say things like, "Know your place, Regina," when she tried to speak up, when she dared to show ambition beyond what was acceptable for a woman like her. Jack wasn't the first to try to keep her in her place, but his words always stuck with her. They stayed like a weight on her chest, even after all these years. Even after she had proved herself time and time again. But she had never truly shaken off the feeling that she was still the little girl from the wrong side of town. The gravel beneath her boots shifted, a crunch breaking through the silence. She turned slowly, her gaze lifting just in time to see his polished black car pull into the long tree-lined driveway. He was here. She didn't move. Jack stepped out, his tailored suit crisp against the afternoon sun. His confident posture a stark contrast to the man she remembered. The man who, years ago, had told her that she would never amount to more than a secretary. The man who used to laugh when she spoke of her dreams, of owning a house like this, of making it big in business, of being someone who could command respect, not just give it. He walked toward her, that familiar, smug grin spreading across his face. She didn't return it. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. "Regina," Jack called, his voice smooth and casual. "It's been a long time." She nodded, her arms still crossed, her posture steady. "Jack," she replied, her voice low but clear. "What brings you here?" He chuckled, taking a few steps closer. He looked around the estate with an air of superiority. "Nice place you've got here," he said, eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge how much of it truly belonged to her. "I earned it," Regina replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to let him see it. "What's on your mind?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Straight to the point, huh? That's what I remember about you. Always so eager to prove something." Regina held his gaze unflinching. "I don't need to prove anything to you." He smiled again, but this time there was a sharper edge to it. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Come on, Regina," he said, lowering his voice. "You really think you belong here? This place? With people like me?" The words stung, but Regina refused to let him see it. She'd heard them before, a long time ago, but now the sting was different. She wasn't the same woman she had been when Jack first told her to know her place. She had fought to get here, and now she wasn't gonna back down. "I don't need your approval, Jack," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And I don't need you to tell me where I belong. I've earned every inch of this." Jack's smile faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You've got some nerve," he muttered, clearly taken aback by her defiance. Regina felt the familiar spark of anger rise in her chest. She had spent years watching people like Jack try to break her down, and now, she was the one standing tall. She wasn't gonna let him get to her. Not now, not ever again. "You know what, Jack?" Regina stepped closer, her voice steady and calm. "Why don't you come inside and let me show you just how far I've come? I'll give you a tour of my estate. A real one, not the one you're imagining." Jack blinked, caught off guard by her sudden shift in tone. His confidence wavered just for a moment. But then he smirked, shrugging as if to say, Why not? As they walked toward the front door, Regina's mind raced. She wasn't just inviting Jack inside for a tour of her home. She was inviting him to see the woman she had become. The woman who no longer took anyone's dismissiveness lying down. Jack's words had always cut deep, but today, they would only serve as the fuel for Regina's quiet, unwavering triumph. As they entered her grand home, she could almost feel the weight of all those years of struggle, of people telling her she didn't belong, melting away. This was her moment. She wasn't going to let him take it from her. "You can start with the living room," she said, gesturing toward the grand space ahead of them. "And when you're done, I'll show you the rest." Regina didn't need to say anything else. She knew deep down that Jack would understand exactly what she meant by the time he left. As Jack stepped over the threshold of Regina's home, the scent of fresh-cut flowers and polished wood greeted him, mixing with the faintest trace of lavender and citrus cleaning spray. Regina's home was spotless, but there was something more. It felt lived in, felt real, the kind of real that made Jack feel uneasy. For a moment, he paused in the entryway, taking it all in. The gleaming marble floors, the sweeping staircase, the rich mahogany banister. He had seen fancy homes before, but this wasn't just money. This was ownership. The kind of ownership he couldn't quite grasp, even after all these years of his own success. Regina closed the door softly behind them, the faint click of the lock echoing in the silence. "I'll show you around," she said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that seemed to command attention. She didn't ask if he was comfortable. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Jack followed her into the living room, where the fireplace was crackling softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the tension that lingered in the air between them. He glanced around, trying to act nonchalant, but his eyes kept darting to the artwork on the walls, framed pieces of abstract art that likely cost more than he'd ever spent on a painting. The polished furniture, the sleek lines of the modern design, it was all so unexpected. He hadn't come here to be impressed, but he was, and it made him uncomfortable. "Nice place," he muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself that his initial discomfort was misplaced. But his words were hollow. He knew it. Regina could tell too. She wasn't about to let him pretend it didn't bother him. "Thank you," Regina said simply. "It wasn't easy getting here." Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed her. People like Regina didn't just get here. They were born into it or they married into it. There was no other way. At least that's what he'd always thought. As they moved deeper into the house, Regina led him through the formal dining room, the kitchen where a fresh pot of coffee sat waiting, and finally into the study. The study was her domain, the one place she had carved out for herself in the middle of her carefully curated life. It was here that she had built the empire she now owned. Her bookshelves were lined with business texts, novels, and even a few old family heirlooms. A few framed photos of her mother and grandmother sat on her desk, reminders of where she came from. "Have a seat," Regina said, gesturing to a leather armchair across from her desk. Jack hesitated for a moment before sitting down, glancing at the collection of high-end whiskey bottles on the cabinet to his left. Regina was more than just a homeowner. She was a businesswoman, an investor, and someone who knew exactly how to make money work for her. She poured herself a glass of whiskey, smooth, aged, and not the cheap stuff Jack was used to. She didn't offer him one. "Tell me," Regina began, settling into her chair behind the desk, her eyes never leaving his. "How's your company doing these days?" Jack's eyebrows furrowed slightly. The question was casual, but he could feel the weight behind it. He shifted in his chair, not quite sure how to answer. It wasn't like he had anything to hide. His business was doing fine. But there was something about Regina's presence that made him feel small in a way he hadn't felt in years. "It's fine," he replied curtly. "Growing as always. You know how it is. The market's tough." Regina smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was knowing, almost patronizing. "Yeah, I know how it is. The market's always tough. But the people who really thrive don't just ride the waves. They create their own currents." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Something about the way she said it made him feel like he was the one struggling to keep afloat, while she was the one steering the ship. Regina leaned back in her chair, eyes still fixed on him. You know, Jack, it's funny how people always think you're supposed to stay in your lane. They see you one way, and they expect you to stay there. She paused, letting the words sink in. But the thing is, lanes don't exist unless you let them. Jack swallowed, feeling a sudden tightness in his chest. He didn't know how to respond. The way Regina spoke, so calmly and assuredly, made it clear that she had already made her peace with her place in the world. She wasn't concerned about what Jack thought of her or how he saw her. She was beyond that. "So, what's it all for, Regina?" Jack asked, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than before. He hadn't meant for the words to sound like that, but they slipped out, curious, almost self-pitying. "All this? What's it for? What's the point of owning everything if it's just you in it?" Regina's gaze softened for a moment, but there was still strength in her eyes. "The point is freedom, Jack. The point is knowing that no matter how many times someone tells you to know your place, you get to decide what that place is." She stood up from the desk, moving towards the window that overlooked the vast, manicured gardens. "I built this place for myself, and I built it because I could, because I wanted to, and I wasn't going to let anyone tell me I didn't deserve it." Jack stared at her back, the words sinking in like stones. She wasn't boasting. She wasn't rubbing her success in his face. She was simply stating the truth. And it was this quiet confidence that unsettled him the most. "You're not the same person I remember," Jack muttered under his breath. Regina didn't turn around, but she smiled to herself. "No, Jack, I'm not. And that's the point." She glanced over her shoulder, catching his eyes. "The world keeps trying to tell you who you are, but the truth is only you get to decide." Regina watched as Jack stood at the large dining table in the center of her formal dining room, his eyes darting from the polished mahogany surface to the fine china that gleamed under the chandelier. The space was elegantly adorned, but there was an unspoken warmth in the room, an atmosphere that suggested it wasn't just for show. It was home, a place where people gathered to share more than just food. She had deliberately invited him to dinner, knowing it would be the next test. The next moment where his assumptions about her would be challenged. She had spent years listening to men like Jack tell her what she could or couldn't do, where she could or couldn't go. And now, in her own home, she was going to show him what it really meant to know your place. The aroma of roasted lamb and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of red wine that had already been poured into their glasses. It wasn't the kind of meal that was meant to be eaten in a rush. It was meant to be savored, an experience, not just sustenance. Jack cleared his throat awkwardly as he set down his glass of wine, unsure of what to do with himself. The place settings were immaculate, the silverware arranged just so. It wasn't just the richness of the decor that made him uncomfortable. It was the way Regina had curated every detail to perfection. The way she held herself with effortless grace, as though this was all second nature. "I didn't expect all this," Jack muttered, his voice a mix of awe and something else, a hint of jealousy. He was trying to hide it, but Regina could see through him. "No, you didn't," Regina replied softly, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. She took her seat at the head of the table, letting the silence settle around them before continuing. "But you should have." Jack took a seat across from her, his discomfort palpable. He had always thought Regina was the type to settle for less, to take whatever was handed to her, to play the role of the woman behind the scenes, the one who was never in control. But this dinner, this house, it was all a reflection of the woman she had become. "So," Jack said, trying to fill the silence as Regina cut into her lamb, her movements measured, deliberate. "What exactly are you doing now? Still in real estate?" Regina placed her fork down and leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied him. "Real estate was just the beginning," she said. "Now I'm investing. I've got my hands in a few different things. The market's full of opportunities if you know where to look." Jack's eyes widened, not fully understanding, and Regina could see that his mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. She didn't offer him any more details. The truth was, Jack wouldn't understand. He was still stuck in his world of corporate deals and tight connections. The world Regina had left behind. He couldn't grasp the fact that she didn't need his approval anymore. And as much as she had once craved his recognition, she realized now that it didn't matter. She had come to a place in her life where his validation, or anyone else's, was no longer a requirement. "Is that why you're living like this now?" Jack pressed, his voice a little sharper than before. "You think you can just step into this life and act like you belong here?" Regina didn't flinch. She had heard that question before. "I don't act like I belong here, Jack," she replied, her tone steady. "I do belong here. I earned it." Jack scoffed, leaning back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "So what? You just think you've outgrown everything? Everyone? Including me?" Regina's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "I haven't outgrown anyone, Jack. I've simply outgrown the idea that I need to fit into the box others have created for me." There was a long pause between them, the kind of pause that spoke louder than any words could. Jack's face reddened slightly, and for the first time since he had arrived, he seemed uncertain, off balance. "You always thought you knew better than me," Jack said, his voice low, almost regretful. "That's what I never understood. You, the girl who worked in a diner, who had no business aiming higher, you were always reaching for something more." Regina picked up her glass of wine, swirling it gently, her fingers caressing the stem of the glass as she took a small sip. "That's where you were wrong, Jack," she said quietly. "I wasn't aiming higher. I was simply aiming for what I knew I deserved." The words hit Jack like a wave, knocking the wind out of him. He had spent so many years looking down on Regina, assuming she was just a fleeting presence in his life, someone who would never rise to meet him at the table he had so carefully constructed for himself. And now, here she was, sitting across from him, perfectly composed, perfectly confident, and perfectly unapologetic for everything she had built. But there was more. There was something that Jack hadn't counted on. Regina hadn't just built this life out of ambition or a desire to prove herself. No, what he didn't understand was that this wasn't about him. It was never about Jack or anyone else. It was about Regina's quiet rebellion, her refusal to let the world tell her who she was or where she belonged. Jack cleared his throat, trying to change the subject, but Regina wasn't having it. She wasn't going to let him sweep this moment under the rug. "You know," Regina said softly, "all these years you thought I wasn't enough, but I was always enough. You just couldn't see it." Jack's face twitched with a mix of frustration and something else. Guilt, perhaps. He had tried to push her into a corner, tried to make her feel small, to keep her in the space he thought she belonged. But that corner no longer existed. Regina had erased it, step by step, with every decision, every challenge, every small victory. "I was wrong about you," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his plate, as if the food suddenly held his attention, but Regina knew what he was really doing. He was avoiding the truth. "You were," Regina said quietly, her voice laced with both compassion and finality. "But that's okay. You don't need to understand now. You never had to." Jack sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It wasn't the triumphant, celebratory moment he had expected. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about the quiet realization that he had underestimated Regina, and that the woman who had once seemed so far beneath him was now standing in a place he could never reach. The evening had turned to night, and the warmth from the roaring fire in the living room had begun to fade, replaced by the soft glow of ambient light from the lamps. Jack's nerves were still palpable, but now they had taken on a different tone. The evening had shifted from uncomfortable to contemplative. Regina hadn't let up, and yet, he felt the undeniable pull of something else, something he couldn't quite place. They walked through the hallway, their footsteps muted on the thick Persian rug that spanned the length of the floor. Every inch of the house was meticulously designed, a reflection of Regina's taste and taste alone. It wasn't a house to impress anyone. It was a house built on purpose. She didn't need to flaunt it, but it had become a symbol of everything she had overcome. Every piece of furniture, every room, even the way the light filtered through the grand windows, seemed to tell the story of her triumph. Regina paused at a door on the left side of the hallway and motioned for Jack to follow her. "This is where I really started," she said, pushing open the door to reveal a space unlike anything Jack had expected. It wasn't the glossy boardroom or the polished corporate offices he had imagined. Instead, it was a large rustic room with dark wooden beams overhead and wide, open windows that allowed the cool night air to stream in. The room smelled faintly of fresh hay and leather. Along the far wall were rows of saddles and old tack, an assortment of cowboy boots lined up next to the door. A barn, tucked inside the walls of a mansion. An odd, but fitting juxtaposition. Regina stepped further into the room, running her fingers along the back of a saddle resting on a wood. The door. "This is where I found my peace. The horses, the barn, the smell of fresh grass and earth. It was simpler, but it was mine." Jack raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "You're telling me you built this empire from the stables?" He couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. It sounded impossible. Regina Walters, the woman who now sat at the helm of multimillion-dollar projects, had spent her days with hay in her hair and dirt under her fingernails? Regina's lips curled into a smile. "Not built, grown. This was where I learned that there's no shortcut to hard work. No way around it." She turned to face him, her eyes locking with his, unwavering. "You've got to be willing to get your hands dirty, Jack. If you're not willing to put in the hours, the sweat, the blood, then it doesn't matter what you wear or how much money you have. You'll never get anywhere." She motioned to a large photograph on the wall. It was of a younger Regina, holding a reins with a horse beside her. The image was black and white, faded with time, but the strength in her posture was still unmistakable. Her eyes were focused, determined, the same way they were now. Jack stepped closer to the photo, squinting at the image. "You were a different person back then. You look different." Regina chuckled softly, crossing her arms over her chest. "People change, Jack, but the drive, the will to prove myself, that's never changed." She walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room, her fingers grazing the edge of the polished wood. A few old documents were neatly stacked beside a ledger. "I started with the horses," she continued, her voice steady, her gaze distant. "But once I learned how to take care of something that depended on me, I started applying that same principle to business, to real estate, to everything." Jack felt a wave of guilt wash over him as he glanced around the room. The stables had been where Regina had laid the foundation of everything she had now. And here he was, standing in the heart of her empire, judging her, assuming that she had taken the easy way out, that she had some kind of magic formula for success. But the truth was, he had never known the half of it. She was the kind of woman who had worked tirelessly to make something from nothing. Her success was no accident. It was the result of years of sacrifice, of pushing herself when others wouldn't, of taking risks when others played it safe. Regina returned her focus to Jack, her eyes searching his face for any sign of understanding. "I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I didn't have the luxury of smooth roads and easy paths. I had to fight for everything. But I've learned that it's not the things you accumulate that define you. It's what you do with them, how you use them to create something real." Jack stood in the doorway, still processing the weight of her words. He had spent so much of his life building his career, stacking up his wealth, filling his life with things. But he realized in that moment that he had missed the point. Regina didn't need things. She needed purpose, and that was something Jack could never have understood until now. "So, you went from horses to real estate," Jack said, his voice quieter now. "That's how you built this?" Regina smiled, but it wasn't an arrogant smile. It was soft, thoughtful. "That's one way to look at it," she said. "But I think it's more about how you manage what you have. A horse doesn't work for you because it's forced to. It works because it trusts you. You have to earn that trust, just like with people, with business, with everything. She moved to a small table against the far wall, where a few papers lay scattered. Picking one up, she handed it to Jack. This is the deed to my first property, the one that started it all, the barn I kept my horses in. I bought it for practically nothing, but I knew it had potential. I saw what others didn't. I had to be patient. I had to wait for the right moment. Jack glanced at the document in his hand, his fingers brushing over the faded paper. He felt a pang of respect for Regina, something he hadn't felt for a long time. He had thought she was just another woman trying to play in a man's world. But the truth was, she wasn't playing. She had been running the game all along. Regina moved closer, standing next to him now, looking out the window at the stables in the distance. It wasn't just about horses or property. It was about building something that couldn't be taken away. Building something that would last. Jack didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. He had come to Regina's home to prove a point, to show her that she was still the girl from the wrong side of the tracks. But now, in the stillness of the room, he realized that she had already won. She had proven it to herself, long before he had arrived. "Come on," Regina said after a long pause. "Let me show you the rest." Jack followed her out of the room, but this time, there was no judgment in his steps, no sneer on his lips. There was only a quiet understanding. She had shown him who she was, and it was far more than he had ever imagined. The night air had turned cooler, and the soft chirping of crickets outside was the only sound that accompanied their walk through the garden. Regina led Jack down the path, her steps steady and sure as she walked ahead, her figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the porch lights. Jack's steps were quieter, his mind still spinning, trying to reconcile the woman he had once underestimated with the powerful figure she had become. Regina didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his thoughts trailing behind her like a shadow, but she wasn't concerned with it. The only thing that mattered now was showing him, and perhaps reminding herself, how far she had come. As they reached the end of the path, Regina stopped and turned to face him. The large fountain in the center of the garden bubbled quietly, its sound soothing, almost melodic in the stillness of the night. "I wasn't always like this, you know," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was a deep gravity to it, a weight that made Jack pause in his tracks. "I know you weren't," Jack replied, his voice still filled with disbelief. "But I never thought you'd, turn out like this." Regina smiled, but it wasn't a triumphant smile. It was one that held years of quiet struggle, of every word she had ever been told she couldn't do, couldn't be. "I wasn't supposed to, Jack," she said, her gaze turning distant. "I wasn't supposed to become someone. I was supposed to stay where I was, in the shadows. That's what they wanted. But I had something they couldn't take away. I had ambition." Jack stood still for a moment, processing her words. They were so simple, but they carried a truth that he couldn't quite grasp. For so long, he had seen Regina as just another part of his past, a person who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But now, standing in her garden, he realized that she had always mattered. She had always been in control of her own story, and he had never been a part of it. "What do you mean? They wanted you to stay where you were?" Jack asked, a hint of confusion creeping into his voice. Regina took a deep breath, her eyes softening as she recalled the past. "It wasn't just one person. It was everyone. The men in my life, the people who looked at me and saw someone who didn't deserve more. My family, my friends, the people I thought I could trust. They all told me the same thing. Know your place, Regina. They told me that I would never be more than what I was born into, that I'd never make it to the table, no matter how hard I worked, because people like me didn't belong there." Jack felt a pang in his chest. He had been one of those people, telling her she didn't belong, that her dreams were unrealistic. And now, standing before him, Regina had not only succeeded but thrived. He hadn't seen it before, but now he saw it clearly. The woman he had once dismissed was standing here, strong and unyielding, and it made him feel small. I spent years fighting that narrative, Regina continued, her gaze turning back to the fountain. I kept hearing their voices in my head, telling me I was too much, too loud, too ambitious. But every time they told me that I used it to fuel me, I knew they were wrong. I knew I had more to offer. And one day I just stopped listening to them. I stopped trying to fit into the boxes they wanted me to stay in. And that's when everything started to change. Jack's heart sank as the weight of her words hit him. He had been so caught up in his own world, in his own success, that he had failed to see the quiet fire that burned within Regina. It wasn't just ambition that had driven her. It was the will to prove herself to the world that had constantly tried to hold her back. And now, here she was owning a life that had once seemed out of reach. You know, when I was younger, I used to tell myself that if I just worked hard enough, I could escape all the people who didn't believe in me, Regina said, her voice quieter now, almost as if speaking to herself. But the truth is, you can't escape that. It stays with you. The words, the doubts, they cling to you like a shadow. But I learned to live with it, to use it. And when I stopped running from it, that's when I really started to thrive. Jack didn't know what to say. His mouth was dry, and the words seemed to stick in his throat. He had spent so many years thinking that Regina was nothing more than a small-town girl trying to play in a man's world. But now, standing in the quiet of her estate, he realized how wrong he had been. She had never been small. She had never been anything less than exactly who she was meant to be. "You've come a long way," Jack said finally, his voice filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I was wrong about you." Regina smiled, but it wasn't a smile that sought validation. It was the smile of a woman who had come to terms with the truth of her own journey. "I know you were, Jack, but it's okay. You're not the only one who was wrong about me." She turned toward the garden again, her gaze softening as she took in the beauty of the night around her. "I built this place with my own hands, not just the house but everything, the businesses, the relationships, the people who matter to me." She paused, turning to face him once more. "You know, you never know how far you can go until someone tells you to stay put." Jack looked down at the ground, feeling a sense of shame wash over him. It wasn't just because he had underestimated Regina. It was because he had been wrong about everything. He had thought that success was just about power and prestige. He had thought it was about being seen. But Regina had shown him that success was about something far deeper. It was about building something real. Something that couldn't be taken away by anyone's words or judgments. Regina stepped closer to him, her presence calm and unyielding. "You can't control how people see you, Jack. You can't control their opinions. But you can control your own story. And that's the part they never tell you." Jack looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that evening without any trace of arrogance or pride. Just understanding. "I never thought about it like that." Regina smiled again, but this time, it was warmer, more genuine. "Most people don't, but that's okay. Not everyone needs to." The days that followed Jack's visit were quiet. Regina spent her time walking the grounds of her estate, managing her investments, and meeting with the team that had helped her turn her vision into a reality. Life, as it had always been for her, was a delicate balance of quiet power and relentless ambition. But this time, something had shifted. Jack's visit had awakened something inside her. A reminder that some battles were still being fought, even if they weren't the kind of battles she liked to acknowledge. She'd spent so many years proving herself to the world, climbing each rung of the ladder, pushing back against every voice that told her she wasn't enough. But now, it wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about owning her place. It was a small, quiet realization, but it carried the weight of years of struggle. Regina had reached a point in her life where everything felt possible. But she also knew that there was something deeper at play, something that demanded not just her effort, but her ability to confront the truths she had buried inside herself. As she sat in the study, the sunlight casting long shadows across the floor, she reflected on her journey. The struggle, the sacrifices, and the people who had tried to keep her in her place. She'd come so far, but in the quiet of her home, she wondered if there was still a part of her that hadn't fully embraced her own power. She thought about the people who had doubted her, the ones who had told her that her dreams were too big. People like Jack, who had underestimated her, dismissed her, and tried to keep her boxed in. But it wasn't just men like Jack. It was everyone. Her family, her friends, the world that had always told her that women like her were meant to stay in the background. But now she wasn't in the background anymore. She was the one in control. The sound of the phone ringing broke her reverie, and she picked it up without hesitation. "Regina," a familiar voice said on the other end. "We've got a problem." It was Eric, one of her closest business partners. She could tell by the tone of his voice that something was wrong. "What's going on?" Regina asked, setting her pen down as she leaned forward in her chair. "We've been approached by a competitor," Eric continued. "They've made a substantial offer for the property in Charleston, the one you've been holding onto for years." Regina's heart skipped a beat. The property he was referring to was a cornerstone of her portfolio, a piece of land that had taken years to acquire, a dream she had nurtured since the early days of her career. It wasn't just a business venture. It was a symbol of her strength, her persistence, her ability to see potential where others saw nothing. "Have they made an offer?" Regina asked, her voice steady despite the tension bubbling beneath the surface. "They have, and it's a good one. But it's not just about the money," Eric said, his voice lowering. "They're trying to push you out, Regina. They want control of the entire district, and they think you're the only thing standing in their way." Regina leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. The weight of Eric's words settled heavily in her chest. It wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was personal. They were trying to take something from her. And this time, it wasn't just about the land. It was about everything she had fought for. She'd known this day would come. People like Jack, like the investors, like the competitors, they never stopped trying to tear down the people they thought didn't belong. But what they didn't understand was that Regina had already gone through that battle. She'd already been knocked down and gotten back up. This was no different. It was just one more challenge to face. One more moment to prove that she belonged at the table, no matter how hard they tried to push her out. "What's the plan?" Regina asked, her voice cool, calculated. "I think it's time to make a counteroffer," Eric said. "They've underestimated you. They think they can outbid you, but they don't realize what you've built." Regina smiled faintly, her mind already working through the possibilities. She wasn't about to let anyone take what was rightfully hers, not without a fight. She had worked too hard for this, too long. And now she wasn't just fighting for the land. She was fighting for her place in the world. "Get the paperwork ready," Regina said firmly. "We'll meet tomorrow. I'm not backing down." After hanging up, she sat still for a moment, the quiet of the room enveloping her. Her hands rested on the desk in front of her, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was at stake. It wasn't just business. It was everything she had built, everything she had fought for, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. The next day, Regina was at the office early, reviewing the details of the counteroffer. She knew the stakes were high. The deal with the competitor wasn't just about money. It was about control. And she had to show them that she wasn't afraid to fight for what was hers. Eric arrived shortly after, and the two of them went over the numbers again. Regina had always been meticulous with the details, and today was no different. She double-checked every line, every figure, making sure that nothing was left to chance. She wasn't just negotiating for the land. She was negotiating for her future. As the meeting with the competitor approached, Regina felt the familiar calm take over her. She had faced challenges before, bigger challenges than this. But this time, she wasn't just going to win. She was going to own it. The competitor's representative arrived with a smug expression, clearly expecting to close the deal easily. But Regina was already prepared. She wasn't just fighting for the property. She was fighting for her place at the table. And when she made her offer, it wasn't just a counteroffer. It was a statement. "I'm not just going to roll over for you," Regina said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. This property is mine, and it will stay mine. The competitor's representative tried to dismiss her, but Regina stood her ground. She knew the value of the land, the potential of the property, and she knew what it meant for her legacy. She wasn't going to let them take it from her. Not without a fight. When the meeting ended, Regina stood tall. She had made her point, and she had made it clear. The competitor may have thought they could push her out, but they didn't know the woman they were dealing with. Regina Walters wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a force to be reckoned with. The weeks after the meeting passed in a blur. Regina was immersed in the intricate web of negotiations, counteroffers, and legal reviews. It was a quiet intensity, one that required her to remain calm on the surface while the gears of strategy and preparation turned rapidly behind the scenes. She had been here before. She had handled crises with the same level-headedness and precision. But this time it felt different. The stakes were higher, the pressure greater, and yet, there was a sense of peace that came with knowing that her fight wasn't just for the land. It was for her entire future. The estate, with all its beauty and grandeur, had become more than just a home to Regina. It was the manifestation of her journey, her resilience, and her ability to push forward despite the odds. Every inch of the estate held a memory, a moment of struggle, a quiet victory, a reflection of the woman who had built it all from the ground up. And now, as she stood in the garden one evening, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals of the roses she had personally planted, Regina felt the quiet strength that had brought her here. It was something deeper than ambition. It was a silent power, one that came from within, one that no one could take away from her. Jack had called a few times after his visit, each time with some excuse or another. He was just checking in, or wanted to catch up. Regina hadn't returned his calls. She did. Others dictate her life, her place in the world. As she walked through the garden, she saw the horses grazing peacefully in the distance. The stable was still there, just as it had been when she first started out. A part of her still clung to the simplicity of those days. The days when all she needed was the sound of hooves on the dirt, the smell of fresh hay, and the quiet solitude of the barn. But she had outgrown that life. She had moved beyond it, and now she was standing on the edge of something even bigger. Regina had learned something important during her journey, the true power of silence. The kind of power that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It was a power that came from knowing who you were and standing in that truth, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The results of her hard work spoke for themselves. The phone call from Eric came late one afternoon. She had been in the office all day, reviewing final contracts for the Charleston deal. Her eyes were tired, but there was still that spark of determination within her that wouldn't allow her to stop until everything was in place. "Regina," Eric's voice crackled through the receiver. "It's done. We've won." Regina closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. The competitor had backed down. They had been forced to concede, and the property, the one that had once felt so fragile, so easily threatened, was now firmly in her grasp. "That's good news, Eric," Regina said quietly, her voice steady. "But I'm not celebrating yet. We still have a lot to do." She hung up the phone and stared out the window, the setting sun casting a golden light over the landscape. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't the finish line. It was just another step in her journey. She had proven herself to the world, but that wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new, something even greater. In the days that followed, Regina's sense of peace grew stronger. She had fought for what she wanted, and now it was hers. But more than that, she had finally come to understand the value of quiet power, the kind that doesn't need to be flaunted, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. She had always known the world wasn't going to give her anything, but she had learned that if you stood firm, if you kept your focus, you could take what was yours without ever having to raise your voice. And that was the real victory. The evening of the official signing ceremony came, and Regina stood in the boardroom, the sleek glass table reflecting the faces of the partners and investors who had helped her secure the deal. The air was charged with excitement, yet Regina remained composed. She didn't need to say much. Her presence in the room spoke louder than anything she could have said. The deal was hers, and her quiet strength was the foundation of it. As the documents were signed and the final agreements put into place, Regina couldn't help but feel a sense of calm satisfaction. She had done it. The estate, the land, the business, it was all hers. And she wasn't finished yet. She wasn't just going to sit back and enjoy the success. She wasn't going to settle. There was always more to build, more to achieve, more to prove. Not to anyone else, but to herself. Because that was the true measure of success. As she left the boardroom, her steps steady and purposeful, she glanced at the window, catching sight of the skyline beyond. The city was alive, full of opportunities, full of challenges. But Regina wasn't afraid. She had already fought the hardest battle. She had fought for herself. And that was the victory that no one could ever take from her. Regina had reached the point of no return. There was no going back now. She had claimed her place at the table, and she was going to make sure she stayed there. Her journey wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the quiet, unwavering belief that she could do anything. And now, no one could ever tell her to know her place again. She had already defined it for herself. The days that followed the signing of the deal were filled with meetings, phone calls, and the kind of quiet hustle that Regina had become so accustomed to. The world outside her estate seemed to buzz with its usual energy, but within the walls of her home, there was peace. A sense of accomplishment that, for the first time, didn't feel hollow. Regina had won, and the realization was settling in slowly. But the victory wasn't as sweet as she had imagined. There was a lingering feeling, a twinge of something that tugged at her chest when she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The deals, the compromises, the sacrifices, all of it had been necessary, but at what cost? As much as she had fought for what was rightfully hers, there was a part of Regina that had lost sight of something important. The lesson she had learned from her years of quiet power was clear. True strength came not from how much you could accumulate, but from how you treated the people around you. Her success had been earned with grit and determination, but Regina knew that real power was measured by humility. The kind of humility that allowed you to lift others up, to recognize that the journey wasn't just about what you built. It was about the relationships you forged along the way. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the garden outside her window took on a cool, twilight hue, Regina stood in front of her mirror. She had just finished a call with her lawyer, finalizing the last of the details for the Charleston property. She looked at her reflection, her face soft under the dim light. The woman who stared back at her was no longer the young girl from the small town who had fought to be seen. She was a woman who had succeeded, but there was something missing. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she picked it up, recognizing the number immediately. "Hey, it's me." Eric's voice came through the speaker. "I just wanted to say congratulations. You really pulled it off." Regina smiled faintly, her fingers tapping against the side of the phone. "Thanks, Eric. We did it. It's been a long road." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Eric spoke again, his voice soft but knowing. "You've worked hard for this. You deserve it. But I think it's time for you to start focusing on something else now. You've earned this, but you've also lost a lot along the way. Maybe it's time to think about the people who helped you get here." Regina's heart skipped a beat. She had expected a congratulatory message, but she hadn't expected this. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I mean that you've been so focused on winning," Eric said. "So focused on proving everyone wrong. But somewhere along the way, you stopped taking care of the people who mattered. You've been so busy climbing, Regina, that you forgot to look back at the people who supported you when you were just starting out." His words hit harder than she expected. He wasn't wrong. In her single-minded pursuit of success, Regina had left some of the people who mattered most in the dust. Her family, her friends, the ones who had believed in her when no one else did. She had pushed them aside, thinking that success was the only thing that mattered. But Eric was right. It wasn't just about winning. It wasn't just about how much you could claim as your own. It was about the connections you made, the people you brought with you, the humility you had to show when you reached the top. Success was meaningless if you couldn't share it with those who helped you get there. Regina felt a lump form in her throat, a sense of guilt rising within her chest. I've been so focused on the goal that I didn't even realize I was losing sight of the people who mattered. Eric sighed. It's easy to do. I get it. But you don't have to keep going down that path. You can still make things right. Regina stood in front of the mirror again, her reflection clearer now. She had built her empire, yes, but she had also built walls around herself. The success she had fought for was starting to feel like a prison. And as much as she had wanted to prove something to the world, she now realized that the most important thing was proving something to herself. That she could live her life with balance. That she could rise to the top without losing the things that truly mattered. I don't know where to start, Regina admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Start by reaching out, Eric said, his voice reassuring. Make the call. You don't have to do this alone. And you don't have to be the only one at the top. Regina put the phone down, her hands trembling slightly. She had always been independent, too independent, perhaps. It had gotten her where she was, but it had also left her isolated. The thought of reaching out to the people she had distanced herself from made her heart ache. But it was the right thing to do. She had built her empire with the belief that it was all about her. But the truth was, she needed people. She needed to make amends. And she needed to show humility, not just in her actions, but in her heart. The next morning, Regina made a list. It wasn't a list of business contacts or opportunities. It was a list of names. Family, friends, colleagues, people she had ignored, people she had pushed aside, people who had once believed in her when no one else did. She started with her grandmother, the woman who had always taught her the true meaning of strength. It had been years since they had spoken, but Regina knew that her grandmother's wisdom was exactly what she needed now. She picked up the phone and dialed the number, her heart beating loudly in her chest as she waited for the line to pick up. Hello. The voice on the other end was familiar, warm, and comforting. Grandma, Regina said, her voice breaking. It's me, Regina. There was a long pause, and then her grandmother's voice, soft but firm, came through the phone. Regina, my girl, I knew you'd come back around. You've been working so hard, but don't forget where you came from. Don't forget who you are. Tears welled in Regina's eyes, the weight of her grandmother's words settling deep within her soul. She wasn't just Regina Walters, the businesswoman. She was Regina, the granddaughter, the daughter, the friend. And she had spent too long running away from the things that mattered most. I'm sorry, Grandma, Regina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I've been so focused on proving myself. I forgot what really matters. Her grandmother chuckled softly. You don't have to prove anything, my dear. The world can be a hard place, but you've always known what's important. Family, love, humility. That's the strength you carry within you. Regina nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm going to make things right. I promise. The conversation ended with a long, loving silence. The kind of silence that spoke volumes without saying a word. Regina felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. A peace that had eluded her for so long. She wasn't just going to fight for the world anymore. She was going to fight for herself. The whole version of herself. The woman who could rise without losing the very things that had made her strong. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Regina had taken the first steps to make amends with the people who mattered most in her life. She had reached out to her family, friends, and old colleagues. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She had built a wall around herself, believing that success was something to be hoarded, something to be enjoyed alone. But now she realized true success wasn't measured by the things you had. It was measured by the relationships you nurtured along the way. Regina had always been in control of her own story, but now she was rewriting it. She wasn't going to let anyone dictate her narrative. Not her competitors, not her past mistakes, and certainly not the voices that had once told her to know her place. It was time for her to take full ownership, not just of her career, but of her future. It was early one morning when the phone rang again. Regina had just finished breakfast in the garden, the sun rising over the property, casting a warm, golden light on the flowers she had planted. She picked up the phone without checking the caller ID, expecting it to be her lawyer or perhaps one of her business partners. "Regina," came Eric's voice, strained and urgent. "You need to get to the office. There's a problem." Regina felt a knot form in her stomach. Her hand gripped the edge of the table as she stood up. "What happened?" "There's been a leak," Eric continued. "Someone got access to the Charleston deal. They're trying to use it against you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. A leak? How was that possible? She had been so careful with the details, so meticulous with every step of the process. She knew better than anyone how to keep things under wraps. "Who did this?" Regina demanded, her voice calm but laced with fury. She could feel the weight of everything she had worked for hanging in the balance. "I don't know yet," Eric replied, his voice tight with tension. "But it's bad. The competitors are getting wind of it. They're trying to push the deal through faster. We might lose the whole thing if we don't act fast." Regina's mind raced. She knew exactly what this meant. If the leak was real, it wasn't just a threat to her business. It was a direct attack on everything she had built. The property, the investments, the future she had so carefully crafted. It was all at risk. "Meet me at the office," she said, her tone firm. "I'll be there in an hour." The drive to her office felt like it took a lifetime. Regina's thoughts spiraled. Who could have leaked the deal? Who could have sabotaged everything she had worked so hard to protect? When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere was tense. The staff was gathered in the conference room, their faces drawn, worried. Regina entered without a word, her presence commanding the room. They all stood as she walked in, but she simply waved them down and took her seat at the head of the table. "Let's get to the point," Regina said, her voice cold. "Who knows about the leak?" Eric stood up first, his face grim. "We're still trying to trace the source, but what we do know is that someone close to us got hold of the documents. The competitors are already using it against us. They're threatening to expose everything if we don't back down." Regina's fingers drummed against the table as she processed the information. It wasn't just a business attack, it was personal. Someone had betrayed her trust, and they were going to pay the price for it. "We can't back down," Regina said, her voice steady. "We're not giving them the upper hand. Whoever is behind this will regret it." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard, grabbing a marker. As she wrote down names and potential leaks, her mind worked through the possibilities. She knew her team. She knew who she could trust and who might have an ulterior motive. She wasn't about to let anyone jeopardize her hard-won position. "This is how we're going to handle it," Regina said, her voice commanding as she turned back to face her team. "First, we trace the source of the leak. We need to know exactly how they got access to the documents. Second, we're going to turn this around. We're not going to hide. We're going to confront this head-on. I want a public statement ready within the next 24 hours. We're going to call their bluff." Her team exchanged uncertain glances, but they trusted her. They always had. "Get to work," Regina said, her eyes fierce. "And make sure you don't leave any stone unturned. We're not just going to defend this deal, we're going to take the fight to them." As the team filed out of the room, Regina stayed behind, her thoughts spinning. She wasn't going to let anyone take what was hers. Not now. Not ever again. The fight was on. Later that afternoon, she met with her legal team to begin drafting a response. The tension in the air was palpable, but Regina's determination kept her focused. She was going to use this to her advantage. She wasn't going to back down. She was going to take control as she always had. When the news broke, when the leak was exposed to the public, it was nothing like what the competitors had anticipated. Instead of caving under pressure, Regina turned the situation around, making the leak into a story of her own resilience. She took the high road, exposing the unethical behavior of her competitors and showing the world that she was not afraid to stand up for what was right. The competitors, expecting her to crumble, were left stunned. Regina's quick thinking and quiet power had once again turned the tables. She had shown the world that no one could push her out of her place. Not now, not ever. The day after the leak was exposed, Regina stood at the window of her office, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. The world seemed to be at peace again, but Regina knew that she had fought a battle she couldn't ignore, and she had won. She had made it clear that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. She wasn't just playing the game, she was changing it. But as she stood there, watching the city below, she knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be someone trying to knock her down, always someone trying to take what she had worked for. But now she had learned that the real power came from within, and no one could ever take that away from her. The morning after the leak had been exposed was unusually quiet. The storm that had raged through her life in the past few weeks seemed to have settled. But Regina knew better. This was just the calm before the real storm. The media had picked up on the story, and the headlines painted her as a woman who had outsmarted her competitors at their own game. She had turned their attempt to push her out into a public spectacle, one that cast her in a light that even the most loyal competitors couldn't deny. But there was a part of Regina, deep inside, that knew this battle wasn't over. This was just one small victory in a much larger war. Her phone rang as she sat in her office, going over the details of the Charleston deal again. It was Eric. Regina. Eric's voice came through the phone, a mix of excitement and caution. We've got another problem. It's not over. They're coming at us from a different angle. Regina sighed, her fingers gripping the edges of her desk. What now? They're trying to discredit the whole deal, even after everything you've done. They found a way to twist the narrative and make it look like you're the one at fault. They're trying to play the victim now. This is getting ugly. Regina's mind raced. This was exactly what she had expected. She knew that the world wasn't going to let her win so easily. If there was one thing she had learned, it was that success came with a price, and the price was always higher than you expected. I'm not backing down, she said, her voice firm. We're going to handle this the same way we handled the last one, head on. I want every piece of evidence on my desk by the end of the day. If they want to play dirty, I'll show them how it's done. Eric hesitated for a moment before responding. I knew you'd say that, but be careful, Regina. They won't stop until they've taken everything from you. Regina's eyes narrowed as she gazed out the window. Let them try. She hung up the phone and leaned away from her. She wasn't just defending her property. She was defending everything she had built, from the ground up. This wasn't about the money or the land. It was about proving something to herself, that she could rise above the noise, that she could take back what was rightfully hers, no matter how many times they tried to knock her down. As the day went on, Regina's determination only grew. She spent hours in her office going over documents, rereading the contracts, and coordinating with her legal team. The competitors' efforts to discredit her were not going to work. She had too much on the line to let their lies take root. When the press conference was finally called, Regina was ready. She had prepared herself mentally and emotionally for the challenge ahead. The media was hungry for a story, and she was going to give them one. But this time, she would be the one in control. The conference room was packed with reporters, cameras, and the hum of anticipation in the air. As Regina walked into the room, the murmur of voices quieted, and every eye in the room turned to her. She was calm, composed, and ready. There was no fear in her now, only the quiet power she had come to embrace. She took her seat at the table, her hands resting lightly on the surface. The reporters wasted no time in firing questions at her. They were eager, trying to bait her into saying something that could be twisted or misinterpreted. Regina, one reporter began, how do you respond to accusations that you manipulated the Charleston deal and lied to your investors? Regina smiled, a faint but knowing smile. I respond by saying that the truth always comes out, no matter how many lies are told. The people I work with know who I am. I have nothing to hide. If anyone is lying, it's not me. The room fell silent. Regina's words were powerful, but there was something even more powerful in her delivery. She wasn't just defending herself. She was taking control of the narrative. Another reporter shot a question her way. Do you think you've overplayed your hand, Regina? Do you really believe you can win this fight? Or are you just trying to salvage your reputation? Regina leaned forward, her eyes focused. I've never played my hand, and I've never needed to salvage my reputation. What I've done on my own terms. This isn't about winning or losing in the eyes of the public. It's about integrity. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. And I'll be damned if I let anyone tear that down. The reporters were stunned into silence. Regina's voice was steady, unshaken, and her words carried weight. She wasn't just defending herself. She was asserting her place in the world. She was showing everyone in that room, and everyone watching, that she would not be pushed aside. The press conference continued, but Regina had already won. She had turned the tables. She had taken their attempt to destroy her and used it as an opportunity to stand taller, to show the world exactly who she was. The next few days were a blur of news articles, social media posts, and public responses. The competitors who had once thought they could undermine her were now scrambling to control the narrative. But it was too late. Regina had already turned the tables, and the world was watching. The calls from her competitors slowed, and the media began to shift its focus. Regina had shown the world that she wasn't afraid to fight back, and that made all the difference. She wasn't just a woman in a man's world. She was a force to be reckoned with. Later that evening, as she stood in her study, looking out over the vast expanse of her estate, Regina felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done it. She had fought back and proven that no one, not even the people who had tried to tear her down, could stop her. Regina had come a long way from the girl who had once been told to know her place. She had fought, she had risen, and she had turned the tables. And now, the world knew that she was a woman who could never be underestimated again. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. She had learned that power wasn't just about owning property or wealth. It was about owning your story, about standing up for yourself, even when the world told you that you didn't belong. Regina Walters had claimed her place, and no one would ever take it from her again. The sun had long set, and the estate was quiet again. The only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the occasional call of distant birds in the garden. Regina stood in the center of her study, the room now bathed in the soft, amber glow of the lamplight. She had spent the past few hours reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, the battles, the victories, the lessons learned along the way. It wasn't just about the land or the properties or even the business deals. It had never been about that. It was about her. Her transformation from the girl who had once been told to know her place, to the woman who had built everything on her own terms, was more than just a success story. It was a quiet rebellion, a story of resilience and inner strength that had taken years to cultivate. And now, in the stillness of her home, Regina realized that this moment was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of something even greater. She walked slowly to the large window overlooking the garden, her hands resting gently on the smooth wood of the windowsill. The estate sprawled before her, a testament to everything she had worked for. But the land, the buildings, the money, it was never what defined her. It was the quiet moments like this, standing alone in the stillness of her home, that made everything worth it. Regina thought back to her grandmother's words. "Don't forget who you are," she had said. And in that moment, standing in her study, Regina realized that she had never truly forgotten. She had only needed to remember. She was not the woman others had tried to make her be. She wasn't just someone's idea of what a successful person should look like. She was Regina Walters, the woman who had risen, who had fought against every odd, who had turned her own dreams into a reality. She had done it on her own terms, and that made all the difference. The quiet power she had found within herself was not loud or flashy. It didn't come with applause or recognition. It came with each decision she had made for herself, each time she had stood tall and unapologetic in the face of doubt. It came from the quiet moments when she chose to keep going, even when the world told her to stop. As she stood there, looking out at the peaceful night sky, Regina felt a sense of contentment. She had faced the darkest days of her life, the days when she wasn't sure if she could go on, and now, she had come through the other side stronger than ever. The road ahead was still uncertain, But for the first time, Regina knew she had everything she needed to face whatever came next. She had fought for her place in the world. She had claimed it, and now no one could take it from her. Regina's phone buzzed on the desk behind her, but she didn't rush to answer it. She didn't need to. She had already done what needed to be done. Her legacy was not something to be decided by the press or the business world. It was something she had built for herself brick by brick, and it was enough. With a soft breath, Regina turned away from the window and walked towards the door, her steps light but purposeful. The future was waiting for her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to meet it head-on. No more doubts, no more questions. She walked down the long hallway toward the garden, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet of the night. The cool air kissed her skin as she stepped outside, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peaceful stillness of the night settle in her heart. And in that moment, she knew her future was hers to create.